What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
She smiled when she said it, like she was handing me a compliment dipped in bleach, sweet on the outside, stinging like hell the moment it touched skin. "I just don't think you're the kind of influence I want around my girls," Aunt Linda said, barely glancing at me while scooping potato salad onto a paper plate shaped like a flag. "You're just too much drama." She didn't say it loud, but she said it clearly, in front of Grandma, my cousins, and Uncle Darren, who coughed into his beer like he'd just witnessed a car crash and couldn't decide whether to look away or lean in. I was halfway through folding a lawn chair when she said it, plastic still creaking under my grip, the sun bouncing off the top of her sunglasses like a spotlight trained on my humiliation. Nobody said a word for a beat. Not even Grandma, and that woman usually can't help herself when someone breaks the sacred peace treaty of family first. I didn't reply. I just smiled, nodded once like I was agreeing with the weather forecast, and finished folding the chair. My ribs were tight, like I was holding in a scream and a laugh at the same time. I walked to my car, got in, and sat in silence for a good 10 minutes before I even started the engine. It wasn't the words that got me, not really. It was the way she said it, as if it were some settled truth, something everyone already knew, like water's wet, or Aunt Carol will bring that same dry-ass spunk cake to every holiday. Like I was the one person at that barbecue who hadn't gotten the memo that I'd become the family embarrassment. But what made the bile rise up into my throat wasn't the insult, it was the history behind it. The years of late-night phone calls where Linda cried to me about Darren maybe cheating again, or the times she asked me to just spot her until the end of the month, because the school fees came early and her paycheck came late. The goddamn car she drove to that same family barbecue was in my name, because her credit was shot and I, being the dumb, loyal niece, wanted to help her get back on her feet. And don't even get me started on the Netflix account that her daughters, those two girls she's so determined to protect from my drama, had been watching. Stranger Things on for 3 years, like it was their God-given right. I'm not some unstable storm of chaos, just tearing through people's lives for attention. I'm just someone who feels things. And maybe I don't always hide it well. Maybe I cry when I get overwhelmed or raise my voice when something hits too deep. Maybe I don't let things go as easily as others pretend to. But what I am is someone who shows up. When Grandma had that scare with her blood pressure, who drove her to the ER and sat with her for 8 hours with no charger and a bag of stale almonds in her purse. Me. When Cousin Maddie's cat died and no one else wanted to deal with the tears, who picked up that damn animal and helped bury it under the lilac bush out back. Me. And when Aunt Linda's youngest got bullied at school last year and didn't want to tell her mom, who did he message at 11:30 at night because he just needed someone who gets it? That's right. Me again. So when she looked me in the eye and tossed that little verbal grenade into the picnic like it was just a casual side dish, something twisted in me, not broke, not shattered, just twisted, tightened into a knot I didn't even know was forming. I realized then that I had spent the better part of my adult life performing emotional labor for a woman who saw me as nothing more than a liability. Someone she tolerated because I was useful, not because she gave a damn. And the worst part is I wasn't even shocked. Just disappointed in myself for not seeing it sooner. That night, after I got home, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't do any of the things she probably expected me to do. Instead, I poured myself a glass of that cheap boxed red that somehow always tastes better when you're pissed off, sat down at my kitchen table, opened a fresh page in my notes app, and started making a list. A list of everything that Linda had in her life because of me. Every single thing I had put my name on, logged into, paid for, covered, approved, vouched for, or otherwise made possible. I was surgical. I was methodical. I was dead calm. It wasn't about revenge. Not at first. It was about recalibration. If I was too much drama for her world, then she could live without the parts of me that made her life a little easier. No more quiet favors. No more IOUs. No more nodding and smiling while someone dressed their insults in pearls and manners. I didn't respond to her text that came in 2 hours after the barbecue, just a simple, "Hope you got home okay." I didn't react when my cousin Maddie posted a story on Instagram with the caption, Sometimes people remove themselves, and that's okay, over a filtered photo of grilled chicken. I just kept making my list. And the more I listed, the more I realized how much of myself I'd been giving away for free. By the time I finished, the wine was gone, my phone was on low battery, and I'd counted no fewer than 7 active, tangible benefits that Aunt Linda was enjoying purely because she had me wrapped around her manipulative little finger. She thought she'd embarrass me at that barbecue, reduce me to a side character in her perfect suburban narrative. She had no idea I was about to become the plot twist that would make her wish she'd kept her mouth shut. And the best part? I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to fight. I was going to take everything back, one quiet, calculated move at a time. She wanted me out of her life? Fine. But she was going to feel it. Not all at once. No. That would be too easy. She was going to feel me disappear piece by piece, until the day she looked around and realized just how much of her comfort had come from the person she thought was too much drama to be worth keeping around. There's a certain satisfaction that doesn't announce itself with fireworks or loud music, a kind of quiet, simmering pleasure that comes from knowing someone who underestimated you is finally beginning to feel the slow sting of consequences. Not because you yelled, not because you caused a scene, but because you removed the very conveniences they mistook for entitlements. It was exactly 1 week after that infamous backyard barbecue, the one where Aunt Linda tossed her smug little insult like it was just a piece of harmless gossip, that she learned her gym membership no longer existed, at least. Not the one she had grown far too comfortable using without ever paying a cent for. I didn't call her. I didn't send a warning text. I didn't do any of the dramatic, reactive things she probably expected from someone she considered too much drama. Instead, I logged into my family account at precisely 8:15 in the morning, clicked Manage Users and removed her name, her access, and every trace of her workout history from my plan like I was clearing dust off a forgotten shelf. You see, years ago, probably 4, maybe 5, because time blurs when you're constantly doing favors you didn't agree to in writing, I had added her to my gym membership under the family add-on deal. She had just had her second kid, and she was talking about wanting to get back into shape and feel like herself again, and when she saw the monthly rate I was paying for the extended family plan, she asked no, hinted that she could be included. And me, being the ever-reliable niece, said sure, why not? I remember the text she sent after her first yoga class. I feel like I can finally breathe again. Thank you. And at the time, it felt good. It felt like I was doing something meaningful, like I was supporting someone I loved, someone who always claimed we were more like sisters than aunt and niece. But the thing about generosity, especially when it's quiet and consistent, is that people stop seeing it as generosity and start thinking of it as a basic service. The monthly auto debit from my account became background noise. The gratitude faded into expectation. And by the time she was bragging to her book club friends about her self-care routine, my name was just a ghost attached to the invoice. That Monday morning, when she walked into FitZone and smiled at the girl at the front desk, probably balancing a protein smoothie in one hand and her car keys in the other, she must have thought nothing of it. Until the scanner blinked red. The girl likely smiled politely, thinking it was a fluke, and tried again. Another red blink. That's when the girl leaned over, typed something into the system, frowned slightly, and said, "I'm sorry, but it looks like this account has been deactivated." And I imagine Linda, with her curated calm and ever-practiced expression of confusion, asking what that meant. I wish I could have been there to see it, the little crack in her perfect mask when she realized she no longer had access to the space where she pretended she was in control of her body, her time, her life. When she texted me 2 hours later, it wasn't accusatory, it was feigned innocence. Hey, so weird, some glitch at the gym? They said the account's gone? Let me know. No question mark. About whether I knew anything. No ownership of the fact that she'd been riding my wallet for half a decade. Just this polished little message designed to make me doubt myself. I waited 4 hours before replying. Not because I needed time to think, but because I knew she was stewing. And when I finally did respond, I kept it short but crystal clear. Oh yeah, I cleaned up my accounts this week. Tightening the budget. Hope you find a new gym you love. I didn't say sorry. I didn't offer an explanation. I didn't make it about feelings or family or misunderstandings. I made it sound transactional, distant, like someone managing a spreadsheet. Because the truth is, when someone cuts you out emotionally, the only thing left to do is match their energy in ways that finally register. She didn't reply that day. But the next morning, Maddie, my cousin and Linda's daughter, posted a mood meme on her Instagram story that read, "People who switch up on you just showed you who they always were." I didn't respond to that either. I just watched the screen, then tapped to the next story, and made a mental note of how quickly people align their narratives when they felt the structure of comfort shaking beneath their feet. They weren't asking themselves what I had done for years. They were only asking why I stopped. But the truth? The gym was just the first cut. The easiest. The soft opening to a much larger shift. Because the moment I removed her from that plan, I felt something in me unlock, a door I hadn't realized I'd been pressing my weight against for years, trying to keep shut out of loyalty, out of habit. Out of fear that standing up for myself would make me look like the exact kind of drama Linda accused me of being. But it didn't. It made me feel clean. Clear. Almost surgical in my intent. Because if someone can publicly strip you of dignity and think they'll still privately benefit from your kindness, then they don't deserve either. And believe me, the gym was just the appetizer. Linda had no idea how many parts of her life were propped up by the same, too dramatic, woman she tried to erase with a single sentence over coleslaw and cold hot dogs. And as I stared at the active devices section of my car leasing app, watching the digital footprint of a vehicle I paid for make its way to Target at 11:52 that morning, I smiled. Because next time, it wasn't going to be a blinking scanner at the gym that ruined her day. It was going to be something with 4 wheels, a Bluetooth connection, and my signature on the lease. There's a kind of justice that doesn't wear a robe or carry a gavel, but instead shows up on a regular Tuesday afternoon, in the form of a parked vehicle that simply refuses to start, no blinking lights, no engine rumble, no explanation, just silence. Heavy and abrupt, like the moment right after a slap you never saw coming. And while I wasn't there to witness it myself, I imagined it vividly, almost too vividly, as I stared at the app on my phone and watched the little icon representing the gray Honda CR-V stop moving in the parking lot of a suburban grocery store. One of those chain places where everything is $1 more expensive but looks slightly fancier, as if stainless steel refrigerators and glass deli cases could hide the same old processed cheese and rotisserie chicken. I had waited for the right moment, not out of malice but precision, because if I was going to take something back, I wanted it to be felt, not just noticed, not just inconvenient, but deeply, unmistakably. Felt, in a way that made it impossible for Linda to dismiss it as another one of my emotional spirals or melodramatic episodes, as she liked to call them in her more condescending moments. The truth is, the car should have never been hers in the first place, not legally, not financially, not in any way that mattered on paper. About 3 years ago, during one of her infamous late-night calls, always beginning with some variation of "I hate to ask you this," but she explained how her credit was still recovering from the divorce, how she'd been denied by 2 dealerships already, and how the only way she could secure a safe, reliable car for her daughters was if someone she trusted completely signed the lease in their name. At the time, I was still caught in that fog of obligation and family loyalty, that deeply ingrained belief that love means sacrifice, even when it costs more than just money. So I did it. I signed. I drove down with her to the dealership, sat through the paperwork, nodded along as the salesman assured me that the terms were flexible and low risk, and then handed over the keys with a smile I didn't entirely feel. She was grateful, of course, that. First, there were thank you texts, promises of covering the monthly payments without fail, and declarations of how I was the only one she could really count on. But like every unpaid favor, the gratitude dissolved over time, until it was just another assumed piece of the puzzle she called her life. And then, slowly, the missed payments started. First, it was just one, with an apologetic Venmo note attached: "Sorry. Things are tight this month. You're a lifesaver." Then another, then 2 in a row, until suddenly I was carrying half the lease without ever stepping into the driver's seat. I never pushed back, never made a scene, never even mentioned it during those awkward family dinners where she'd talk about how independent women find a way, sipping wine I knew she didn't budget for. I kept my mouth shut because that's what I'd always done, keep the peace, let it slide, be the one who doesn't make things uncomfortable. But something shifted after that barbecue. Something deep. Something final. And when I scrolled through that list I made, the list of everything she took from me, one way or another, I stopped at that car and realized, with a cold clarity that felt like truth, that it was time to drive that particular kindness straight off the edge of her entitlement. The remote disable feature was never something I thought I'd use. I remember when the dealership explained it to me, part of the fancy package meant to help recover stolen vehicles or locate your car in a crowded parking lot, and I'd laughed, saying, hopefully I'll never need that. But now, as I sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee that had long gone cold, finger hovering over the button that simply read, disable ignition, I didn't laugh. I just tapped it and watched the screen confirm my command. The silence that followed was louder than any argument we'd ever had. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. Then came the texts, short at first, then increasingly frantic. Hey, car won't start, do you know anything? Followed by, did you do something? And finally, I have kids, for God's sake, this isn't funny. And still, I didn't reply. Not immediately. I wanted her to sit with the uncertainty for a little while, to feel the disorientation I had swallowed for years every time she asked for one more thing, one more favor, one more slice of me carved off and handed over without thanks. When I finally did respond, it was with the kind of calm that cuts deeper than rage. The car is in my name. Payments haven't been made in months. I decided I'm not financing your life anymore. Call a Lyft. She didn't reply right away. But I saw, through the app, that the car stayed parked for hours. She must have called someone else to come get her, or maybe she sat there, fuming, trying to piece together how her carefully curated reality had begun to unravel without a single scream or slammed door from me. What she didn't understand, or maybe refused to believe, is that real power isn't loud. It doesn't have to be. Sometimes, it looks like a phone app with a gray button. Sometimes, it looks like a woman who's finally done apologizing for making people comfortable at her own expense. And sometimes, it looks like a parked car that's never going to start again, not for her anyway. That night, after the storm of her messages finally stopped, I opened my Netflix app and noticed her profile was still logged in Linda and the girls, complete with a pastel icon and a continue watching list that hadn't changed in days. And as I stared at that screen, something in me shifted again, just a little. Not out of spite, not out of revenge for its own sake, but because I realized that people like her never stop taking, not until you start taking back. The gym had been the first nudge. The car, the push. But now? Now it was time to cut the cord entirely. Because if someone can strip you of your dignity in public and still expect the comfort of your kindness in private, then maybe they were never family to begin with, just a user wearing a familiar face. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a deliberate act, not the kind born of confusion or panic, but one that settles over everything with the cold assurance of clarity, a silence that feels earned, necessary, even sacred. And that was the precise feeling I experienced when I finally logged into my Netflix account, scrolled past the familiar clutter of profiles, and clicked the red Remove Access from All Devices button, knowing full well that by the time Aunt Linda and her daughters settled in for their usual evening of streaming and popcorn, they'd be staring at a login screen that no longer recognized them. The absurd thing is, it wasn't even about the streaming service. It wasn't about the 6 screens or the high-def picture quality or the carefully curated watch list full of reality shows and Hallmark originals. It was about what that login symbolized. The comfort, the access, the quiet leeching of convenience that people like Linda build their lives around without ever acknowledging the source, let alone thanking it. And I didn't expect her to thank me. I didn't even want an apology. What I wanted was distance, measured not in miles, but in logins, leases, monthly payments, and unreciprocated emotional labor that had stacked up year after year like laundry nobody else seemed willing to wash. The moment I revoked access, I stared at the empty profile list for a few seconds longer than necessary, watching as the screen adjusted itself, as if even the algorithm knew something had changed, something final and irreversible. And then, without hesitation, I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and started making dinner, not because I was hungry, but because reclaiming your peace often starts with the smallest of rituals, the kind that remind you you're still in control of your own space, your own body, your own time. It was during that dinner, a lazy Tuesday meal with half-wilted vegetables and reheated rice, that the text started. First, it was Maddie, short, clipped, vaguely aggressive in that passive way teenagers think makes them sound mature. Did you change the Netflix password or something? Then, 10 minutes later, Linda chimed in, less performative this time and more biting, with a sharp edge that told me this wasn't just about inconvenience. It was about exposure, the kind that happens when someone realizes the lifelines they took for granted are being severed one by one. Is there a reason we can't access Netflix tonight? My kids are upset. This feels petty. And that word, petty, carried more weight than she likely intended, because for people like Linda, any boundary that doesn't benefit them is labeled petty. Any consequence that isn't softened by apology is vindictive. And any assertion of self-respect from someone they used to control is immediately rebranded as overreaction. I didn't answer right away. I let the message sit, let her sit in the discomfort of not getting an instant reply, because the truth is, Linda had spent years watching me contort myself to be available, agreeable, accommodating, texting back within minutes, picking up late-night calls, rearranging my schedule, my finances, my energy to match her emergencies, and now that the faucet had been turned off, she didn't know how to drink from her own well. When I finally responded, it was with the kind of pointed grace that's often mistaken for cruelty. I thought you didn't want your kids around my drama. So I made sure there's no trace of it in your living room anymore. The read receipt popped up within seconds, but she didn't reply. Not right away. Instead, about 30 minutes later, my phone rang, and for a moment I considered declining it out of habit, but something made me answer. Maybe curiosity, maybe closure, maybe just the simple pleasure of hearing what her voice sounded like without the safety net of assumption. "Look," she said, skipping past hello, her voice unusually tight and too calm, the kind of calm that always precedes a storm. "I get that you're upset. You feel like I crossed some line at the barbecue, and maybe I did, but this whole thing is over the top, don't you think?" I could hear her trying to pull the situation back into her control, to reframe the narrative around my supposed emotional instability, to recenter herself as the rational adult in a conflict of my own making. And I almost let her. For half a second, I considered softening, explaining, giving her an out that would preserve her ego while still maintaining my stance, but then I remembered the months of unpaid car bills, the years of borrowed, streaming access, the late-night phone calls where I played therapist while she played victim, and I realized she didn't deserve the benefit of my doubt anymore. "No, Linda," I said, my voice steady, not angry, just tired of pretending I owed her the version of myself that never pushed back. "You don't get to label me dramatic while living off my name. You don't get to insult me in front of our family, then turn around and expect me to subsidize your comfort." I took back my space, my silence, and my streaming account. "If your kids are crying, maybe explain to them what accountability looks like." She didn't like that. I could hear it in the pause that followed, the inhale sharp and unfiltered, the way her pride caught in her throat before she hung up without another word. Later that night, I got the call I'd been half expecting and half dreading. "Grandma." Her voice was soft, cautious, and laced with that specific tone only grandmothers can use, the one that sounds like love wrapped in disappointment, curiosity disguised as concern. "Honey," she said, dragging the word out like she was trying to smooth the tension before it reached the surface. "What's going on between you and Linda?" "She's saying you're lashing out, that you're angry about something, and now the kids are upset. I just want to understand." And that's when I realized that all these years, I hadn't said a word, not to Grandma, not to anyone, because part of me hoped that someone, anyone, would notice on their own. That someone would see the unevenness, the unspoken transactions, the quiet exploitation of a woman who had been taught to stay quiet for the sake of family unity. So I told her. Not everything, not with venom, but enough. I explained the gym membership, the car lease, the streaming account, the payments, the texts, the emotional labor. I told her, without bitterness, but with precision, that Linda hadn't just hurt my feelings, she had used me. And when I was no longer useful, she labeled me dramatic to erase the debt of gratitude she owed. For a moment, Grandma didn't say anything. And then, finally, she let out the kind of sigh that sounds like surrender. "Why didn't you ever tell me this before?" she asked quietly. And I answered with something I hadn't said aloud until that very moment. Because I thought if I was quiet enough, kind enough, she'd stop stepping on me. But now I know people like her don't stop unless you make them. And in that moment, as the silence stretched between us again, I realized this wasn't just about Netflix or a car or a gym. This was about rewriting the rules of engagement. This was about finally teaching my family, my entire family, how to treat me. Not as an accessory. Not as a utility. But as a person with limits. Because if you don't define your boundaries, someone else will define them for you, and they will always draw them smaller than you deserve. There's a distinct kind of quiet that settles over a dinner table when someone's absence says more than their presence ever could, and that Sunday, as we sat around Grandma's familiar oak table, chipped at the edges, stained with decades of memories, and worn in all the places that mattered, it wasn't the roast chicken or the mashed potatoes that drew attention, but rather the chair that sat empty at the far end, the one that usually belonged to Aunt Linda, who, for the first time in years, had chosen not to show up. Nobody addressed it outright, at least not in the beginning, not in the way that families tend to dance around the obvious when the truth is heavy and recent and still burning at the edges. There were attempts at normalcy, little fragments of small talk about football, fall weather, and the price of gas, but everyone kept glancing subtly, curiously, some with more judgment than others, toward me, the woman who had, in the span of a few days, pulled the plug on years of unspoken allowances, who had, without raising her voice or making a public declaration, shifted the entire family dynamic with the slow precision of someone who was no longer afraid to be labeled the villain in someone else's carefully curated story. I knew the questions were coming before they ever left anyone's lips. It was in the way Cousin Maddie kept looking down at her phone, pretending to scroll, but not typing, not reacting, just waiting, like she was holding onto something that couldn't quite stay contained. It was in Uncle Darren's tight jaw and Grandma's anxious fingers tapping against her water glass, and even in the way the dog, old, blind in one eye, and always sensitive to tension, refused to leave my side, as if he sensed that I was the one they'd come to see. Not because they wanted to, but because I was suddenly the unexpected centerpiece of a story none of them had written. It didn't take long for the first comment to land, wrapped in casual language and false concern, dropped like a pebble meant to cause ripples. "So, Cousin Jake muttered, stabbing at his green beans with a fork that had seen better decades. Heard there was some car trouble earlier this week. Linda mentioned something on Facebook, kind of vague. Everything all right?" It was the kind of question designed to sound harmless, innocent even, but behind his tone was the real inquiry. Are you seriously the one who disabled her car? Are you really doing this now, with family watching? I could feel every eye on me, even the ones pretending not to care, and in that moment, I took a slow breath, folded my napkin into my lap, and chose honesty over diplomacy, not for drama, not for spectacle, but because I had spent far too many years avoiding the discomfort of truth just to keep the illusion of harmony intact. "The car is in my name," I said, my voice steady, even as though I were reading from a script I'd written 100 times in my head. "I made the payments. She stopped paying. I turned it off. Simple as that." There was a pause, not shock exactly, but a kind of stunned acknowledgement, as though they all knew, somewhere deep down, that there was more to the story than the version Linda had offered in whispers and subtweets and performative concern. And then, as if she had been waiting for the air to crack just enough, Grandma finally spoke, her voice the kind of soft that comes only after years of mediating other people's conflicts, a voice that had soothed toddlers and reprimanded grown men with equal weight. I just wish we could all sit at one table again, she said, not looking at me directly, but at her plate, her fork, the condensation on her glass, anything but the emotions rising in her own chest. It used to be so simple. That's when I realized the nostalgia she clung to was for a time that never actually existed, at least not for me. It was never simple. Not when I was covering payments behind the scenes, not when I was fielding Linda's crises while she told everyone else how unhinged I was, not when I was shrinking myself down to fit the role of the good niece, the one who helped, who listened, who sacrificed without asking for anything in return. And now that I had drawn a boundary, now that I had stopped pretending everything was fine while being bled dry, I was suddenly the reason things were no longer peaceful. I could have stayed quiet. I could have let it hang there, let them interpret my silence as guilt or regret. But instead, I lifted my eyes and said, calmly, deliberately, "We never sat at one table, Grandma, not really." Some of us were always seated a little further away, expected to bring things but not speak up, to be useful but never central. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done pretending that silence equals harmony. The table was quiet again, but this time the quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, heavy, a silence that invited reflection rather than avoidance. I saw it in the way Grandma nodded slowly, in the way Uncle Darren shifted in his seat like someone beginning to connect long-separated dots, in the way even Maddie looked up from her phone, eyes searching mine as if for the first time she wasn't sure which side she was on. And then, as the meal went on, with more chewing than chatting, more silence than stories, I felt something else settle in, not peace, not yet, but the beginnings of balance, of a reordering, of a dynamic that no longer rested entirely on my shoulders. That night, as I washed dishes with Grandma, our routine for years, uninterrupted by any recent drama, she finally said what I think had been living at the back of her mind for a long time. "Linda's always been difficult," she murmured, rinsing a plate that had seen too many meals and not enough truths. "I just didn't know it was costing you this much." I didn't respond right away, because what could I say that wouldn't sound like blame, like accusation, like a demand for a retroactive defense I no longer needed? So instead, I just placed the plate in the drying rack and said, quietly, I didn't either. Not until I stopped paying. We didn't talk about it again that night, but as I gathered my things and headed out into the cool air, I passed by the same Target parking lot I'd seen from my car app days earlier, the same one where Linda had discovered that her ride, her routine, her illusion of control had suddenly disappeared. And there, by the entrance, I saw her. Not up close. Not in confrontation. Just passing by, pushing a cart, kids in tow, looking tired and stretched thin in a way I'd never seen her before, her phone pressed to her ear, her eyes darting, but not seeing me. For a split second, our eyes met. She looked away first. And in that tiny moment, I realized she still believed she held the upper hand, that my silence would eventually break. That guilt would bring me crawling back into her version of the story, where she's the wounded hero, and I'm the unstable wreck who needs to apologize. But I didn't stop walking. I didn't wave. I didn't acknowledge the false gravity of her gaze. Because some people mistake generosity for weakness and silence for surrender. But not anymore. She can keep her version of the story. I've already started writing the sequel.